I never thought a frozen driveway would become the catalyst for the most absurd war I'd ever fight. But when Patricia Vanderbilt knocked on my door at 7 in the morning with a clipboard and a scowl, I knew my peaceful life in Ridgewood Estates, Colorado, was about to get complicated. "Mr. Xerxes," she said, her voice dripping with barely contained fury, "I witnessed you using a propane torch on your driveway ice yesterday evening. That is a direct violation of Section 4.7, subsection B of the Ridgewood Estates Homeowners Association Guidelines regarding open flame usage on common property boundaries." I stared at her, still half asleep, coffee mug in hand. "My driveway isn't common property. It's my driveway. Your driveway borders the sidewalk, which is considered a transitional space under our regulations." She thrust a piece of paper at me. "This is your fine, $500. Payment is due within 30 days. I looked at the paper, then back at Patricia. She was exactly what you'd expect from an HOA president in an upscale Colorado subdivision. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair, expensive athleisure wear, and an expression that suggested she'd never heard the word no in her entire 50-something years of existence. "I was melting ice," I said slowly. "It was either that or risk breaking my neck walking to my car. You should have used approved de-icing methods, salt, sand, or mechanical removal." I did use salt. The ice was 2 inches thick after that freezing rain. The torch was faster. Rules are rules, Mr. Xerxes. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I expect payment within the specified time frame. Good day." She turned and walked away, her designer sneakers somehow not slipping on the very ice we'd been discussing. I stood in my doorway, looking at the fine, feeling my blood pressure rise with each word I read. $500 for using a torch for maybe 10 minutes to clear a dangerous ice sheet from my own property. I'd moved to Ridgewood Estates 6 months ago, drawn by the mountain views and the promise of a quiet suburban life after years of living in downtown Denver. The house was perfect, a craftsman-style beauty with 3 bedrooms, a 2-car garage, and a backyard that faced the foothills. What I hadn't counted on was Patricia Vanderbilt and her iron-fisted control over every aspect of neighborhood life. The first week, I'd gotten a warning about my trash, cans being visible from the street for more than 12 hours after collection. The second week, another warning because my grass was a 1/4 inch too long. I thought those were flukes, overzealous enforcement that would ease up once I proved myself a reasonable neighbor. I was wrong. I called my neighbor, Dave Matthews, no relation to the musician, as he always made sure to clarify, who'd lived in Ridgewood for 5 years. Dave was a software engineer who worked from home, and we'd struck up a friendship over our shared love of craft beer and complaints about HOA nonsense. "Dude, she fined me $300 last year for having a wreath on my door past January 15th, Dave said when I told him about the torch incident. "Apparently, holiday decorations are only permitted until January 10th. This is insane. $500 for melting ice on my own driveway. Welcome to the Vanderbilt regime. She's been president for 3 years, and every year she gets worse. Last month, she tried to fine the Hendersons because their dog barked during designated quiet hours. Designated quiet hours. 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. on weekdays, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. on weekends. It's in the bylaws she pushed through last year." I sat down at my kitchen table, still holding the fine. "There's got to be something we can do. You can appeal to the HOA board, but good luck." Patricia stacked it with her friends. Margaret Chen and Robert Sullivan are the other 2 voting members, and they rubber stamp everything she proposes. After hanging up with Dave, I spent the rest of the morning reading through the entire HOA covenant. It was a 78-page document written in dense legalese that seemed designed to give the board maximum authority over minimal things. The section on open flames was particularly ridiculous. It prohibited any open flame devices except for approved barbecue grills in designated areas, citing fire safety concerns. The irony wasn't lost on me. We lived in Colorado, where wildfires were a legitimate concern, but a small propane torch used for 10 minutes on a sheet of ice in January wasn't exactly a threat to public safety. I'd been careful, kept the flame low, and melted the ice efficiently. The alternative, chipping away at 2 inches of ice with a shovel in 15-degree weather, would have taken hours. But as I read further, I found something interesting. While the rules prohibited open flames, there were no restrictions on electrical appliances used for property maintenance. Heat guns, electric ice melters, even industrial fans were all permissible. An idea began forming in my mind. I spent that afternoon at Home Depot, wandering the aisles until I found what I needed. I bought the most powerful hair dryer they had in stock, a commercial-grade model designed for salon use. It had 3 heat settings and a motor that could run continuously for extended periods. I also picked up several heavy-duty extension cords and a power strip rated for high amperage. The weather forecast predicted another freezing rain event for that weekend. Perfect. Saturday morning arrived with temperatures hovering just below freezing and a light sleet beginning to fall. By afternoon, my driveway was once again coated in a thick layer of ice. I watched from my window as the precipitation continued, seeing the ice grow thicker with each passing hour. Around 4 p.m., I saw Patricia making her rounds through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, probably looking for violations to document. At 5 p.m., after the sleet had stopped and the ice had set firm, I made my move. I carried the hair dryer outside, plugged it into my garage outlet using the extension cords, and positioned myself at the top of my driveway. Then I turned the hair dryer to its highest setting and began slowly, methodically moving it back and forth across the ice. The warm air hit the ice surface, and water began to form almost immediately. It was slower than the torch, significantly slower, but it was working. More importantly, it was completely within HOA regulations. No open flame, just an electrical appliance being used for property maintenance. I'd been at it for about 30 minutes when Patricia appeared at the edge of my driveway. She stood there, watching me with her arms crossed, her expression growing more annoyed with each passing minute. "What are you doing?" she finally asked. "Melting ice," I replied, not looking up from my work, "with an approved electrical appliance. No open flames, completely within HOA guidelines." Her jaw tightened. "This is absurd. You can't seriously intend to melt your entire driveway with a hair dryer." "Why not? The rules say no open flames. They don't say anything about hair dryers. I'm following the regulations to the letter. This is a waste of electricity and a noise disturbance." I paused and looked at her. It's 5:30 p.m. on a Saturday, well within permitted noise hours, and what I do with my electricity on my own property is my business as long as I'm following HOA rules, which I am. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. I could see her mind working, trying to find some regulation I was violating. Finally, she said, "We'll see about this," and walked away. I continued my work. The hair dryer hummed steadily, blowing hot air across the ice. Neighbors began to notice. Dave came over around 6 p.m., bringing a 6-pack of beer. "I heard you were out here with a hair dryer," he said, grinning. "I had to see it for myself." "Malicious compliance," I replied, taking a beer. "If they want to fine me for using efficient methods, I'll use inefficient ones that follow their rules exactly. How long is this going to take? I surveyed my driveway. I'd cleared about a quarter of it in 90 minutes. Probably another 4 or 5 hours, maybe more. Dave laughed. You're serious about this? Completely. I'm not paying that $500 fine, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows how ridiculous these rules are. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. By 7 p.m., several neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching my progress. Some thought it was hilarious. Others seemed concerned about the precedent it might set. Patricia drove by 3 times in her white BMW, glaring each time she passed. The temperature dropped as evening set in, making the ice harder and the melting slower. I adjusted my technique, holding the hair dryer closer to the surface, moving it in smaller circles to concentrate the heat. My arms ached from holding the dryer, and my hands were numb despite my gloves. But I kept going. Around 8 p.m., Margaret Chen arrived. She was the HOA board secretary, a stern woman in her 60s who'd retired from a career in accounting. She approached me with the same clipboard Patricia had carried that morning. "Mr. Xerxes, this is becoming disruptive," she said. "Several neighbors have expressed concern about the noise." "Which neighbors?" I asked. "Because I see about 6 people standing right there who seem more entertained than disturbed." She pursed her lips. "The noise ordinance permits sounds up to 65 decibels during these hours. A hair dryer exceeds that threshold." I pulled out my phone and opened a decibel meter app I'd downloaded earlier, anticipating this exact argument. I held it near the hair dryer. 58 decibels. Well within the permitted range. Margaret's expression soured. "This is a frivolous use of common electrical infrastructure. I'm plugged into my own garage outlet, powered by my own electricity that I pay for. There's no common infrastructure involved." She wrote something on her clipboard, muttered something about consulting with the board, and left. I kept working. By 9 p.m., I'd cleared about half the driveway. My back was killing me, and I'd gone through 2 more beers that Dave kept bringing out. More neighbors had joined the audience, including some who'd brought folding chairs and were treating it like an event. Someone had even made popcorn. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here I was, on a Saturday night in January, melting my driveway with a hair dryer because the HOA had decided that efficient ice removal violated their arbitrary rules. But I was committed now. This had become bigger than just the fine. It was about pushing back against the petty tyranny that Patricia Vanderbilt represented. Around 10 p.m., Patricia returned, this time with Robert Sullivan, the 3rd member of the HOA board. Robert was in his early 40s, a real estate attorney who'd bought into the neighborhood's most expensive house and seemed to view his board position as a status symbol rather than a responsibility. "Mr. Xerxes," Robert said in his practiced lawyer voice, "we need to discuss this situation." "Nothing to discuss. I'm following all HOA rules and regulations. You're making a mockery of the association." "No, I'm demonstrating how ridiculous the rules are. There's a difference." Patricia stepped forward. "If you don't stop this immediately, we'll be forced to take further action." "What action?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I'm not violating any rules. I checked, twice." Robert and Patricia exchanged glances. Finally, Robert said, "We'll call an emergency board meeting to address this loophole." "Go ahead," I replied. "But until you change the rules, I'm going to keep using my hair dryer whenever I need to remove ice. And given that we're in the middle of winter in Colorado, that's going to be pretty often." They left, both looking furious. The crowd of neighbors applauded, and I took a bow, despite my aching arms and frozen hands. By midnight, I'd finally cleared the entire driveway. The hair dryer had been running for nearly 7 hours straight, and I was exhausted. But the driveway was clear, and I hadn't violated a single HOA rule in the process. Sunday morning, I woke up to an email from the HOA board. They were calling an emergency meeting for Tuesday evening to discuss equipment usage restrictions for property maintenance. The agenda explicitly mentioned inefficient or excessive use of electrical appliances for tasks better suited to other methods. I forwarded the email to Dave, who forwarded it to several other neighbors who'd grown tired of Patricia's increasingly restrictive rules. By Monday afternoon, word had spread throughout Ridgewood Estates. People were talking about attending the meeting, many of them ready to voice their own complaints about HOA overreach. Tuesday evening, I arrived at the community clubhouse 15 minutes before the meeting's scheduled start time. I expected a handful of people, maybe a dozen at most. Instead, I found nearly 50 residents packed into the room, with more arriving every minute. The air buzzed with conversation, most of it critical of the current board. Patricia stood at the front table, looking increasingly uncomfortable as more people filed in. Margaret and Robert sat beside her, shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact with the crowd. At 7 p.m. sharp, Patricia called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for attending this emergency session," she began. "We're here to discuss proposed amendments to our property maintenance guidelines, specifically regarding the use of electrical appliances for ice and snow removal." "You mean you're here to punish Harry for making you look stupid?" someone called out. I recognized the voice as belonging to Jennifer Hartley, a single mom who lived 3 houses down and who'd received numerous warnings about her kids' bikes being visible in her front yard. Patricia's face reddened. "This is about maintaining community standards and ensuring efficient use of resources." "Resources?" Dave stood up. "Harry was using his own electricity on his own property. What resources are being wasted?" "The precedent," Robert interjected. "If everyone starts using inefficient methods for basic tasks, it reflects poorly on the entire community." "But you're the ones who made the efficient method illegal," I said, standing up. "I used a propane torch because it was the fastest, safest way to remove dangerous ice from my driveway. You fined me $500 for it. So I used a method that complies with your rules, and now you want to ban that too." The room erupted in supportive murmurs. Several people called out their own stories of excessive fines and arbitrary enforcement. A man named Thomas described being fined for having his garage door open for more than 30 minutes while he cleaned it. A woman named Lisa talked about a warning she'd received for planting flowers that weren't on the approved species list. Patricia banged her gavel, trying to restore order. "These are separate issues that can be addressed through the normal complaint process." "The normal complaint process where you and your friends rubber stamp everything," Jennifer called out. "We're all tired of it, Patricia. These rules have gotten out of control." Margaret stood up. "If you don't like the rules, you shouldn't have bought homes in a planned community." "We bought homes here for the location and the quality, not to be nickel and dimed with constant fines over ridiculous violations," Dave countered. The meeting devolved into chaos. People were shouting, some at the board, some at each other. Patricia kept banging her gavel, but it was useless. Finally, she stood up and shouted, "This meeting is adjourned. We'll reconvene when everyone can behave civilly." She stormed out, followed by Margaret and Robert. The residents stayed, continuing their discussions. Someone suggested organizing a petition to recall the board. Someone else mentioned reviewing the bylaws to see if there were term limits or other restrictions on board power. I stayed for another hour, listening to neighbors share their frustrations. It became clear that I wasn't the only one who'd been dealing with Patricia's authoritarian approach to HOA management. She'd systematically alienated a significant portion of the community with her strict enforcement and unwillingness to consider common-sense exceptions to the rules. Over the next few days, things escalated. Patricia sent out another email announcing that the board had voted to amend the property maintenance rules to include restrictions on any equipment usage deemed excessive or unreasonable by the board. The amendment would take effect immediately. In response, a group of neighbors, led by Dave and Jennifer, organized a petition to call a special election to recall the entire board. Under the HOA's bylaws, if 20% of homeowners signed the petition, an election had to be held within 60 days. I threw myself into the recall effort. We went door to door, explaining the situation and gathering signatures. Most people were eager to sign. Even residents who hadn't been directly affected by Patricia's enforcement recognized that her approach was creating an unpleasant atmosphere in what should have been a friendly neighborhood. Patricia fought back. She sent an official letter to every household warning that the recall effort was being led by malcontents seeking to undermine community standards. She organized her own counter-petition, though it struggled to gain support. She also began more aggressive enforcement of existing rules, apparently hoping to intimidate people into backing down. She fined the Hendersons for their barking dog again, this time adding a daily penalty fee. She issued warnings to 3 families for having decorative yard ornaments that allegedly violated aesthetic guidelines. She even tried to fine Dave for having a wreath on his door, claiming it was a violation despite it being February and Valentine's Day approaching. But her aggressive tactics backfired. Every new fine, every new warning just added fuel to the recall movement. Within 2 weeks, we had signatures from 35% of the homeowners, well above the required threshold. The special election was scheduled for mid-March. 3 slates of candidates emerged, Patricia and her allies seeking to retain their positions, a moderate group promising reasonable reform, and a slate that included Dave, Jennifer, and myself, running on a platform of dramatic changes to how the HOA operated. The campaign was intense. Patricia went negative immediately, distributing flyers that painted the recall as an attempt by rule breakers to turn Ridgewood Estates into a lawless mess. She pointed to my hair dryer incident as evidence of the chaos that would ensue if we were elected. We countered by highlighting the excessive fines, the arbitrary enforcement, and the hostile environment Patricia had created. We held a town hall where residents shared their experiences. The stories were damning. A retiree who'd been fined for leaving his trash cans visible while he was in the hospital. A family threatened with liens because their teenager's car leaked a tiny amount of oil on their driveway. A woman who'd received a warning for having a garden gnome that was inconsistent with community aesthetics. The local media picked up the story. A reporter from the Denver Post wrote an article about HOA wars in Ridgewood Estates, which went viral on social media. Suddenly, we were getting messages of support from people across the country who dealt with similar HOA nightmares. The attention seemed to push Patricia over the edge. A week before the election, she sent out an email announcing that she was personally conducting property compliance audits of every home whose residents had signed the recall petition. She claimed it was routine, but the timing and targeting were obvious. She showed up at my house on a Tuesday afternoon with Margaret and a tape measure. For 3 hours, they examined every visible aspect of my property, measuring grass height, checking paint colors against approved palettes, inspecting my mailbox for compliance with design standards. They found nothing wrong, which seemed to frustrate Patricia immensely, but she didn't give up. The next day, I received a notice that my fence was potentially non-compliant because it might be a quarter-inch taller than the maximum allowed height. The notice demanded that I hire a licensed surveyor to verify the fence height at my own expense, estimated at several $100s. I'd had enough. I called a lawyer, an attorney named Sarah who specialized in HOA disputes. She reviewed my case along with the pattern of enforcement Patricia had demonstrated over the past months. "This is harassment," Sarah said after hearing the whole story. "She's clearly retaliating against you for organizing the recall. That's not just an HOA violation, it's potentially actionable in civil court." "I don't want to sue," I said. "I just want her to stop. Sometimes the threat of legal action is enough. Let me send her a letter." Sarah drafted a cease and desist letter outlining the harassment and threatening legal action if it continued. She sent it certified mail to Patricia, with copies to Margaret and Robert. The response was immediate and unhinged. Patricia called an emergency board meeting, without me or any of the other targeted residents in attendance, and voted to fine me an additional $2,000 for vexatious conduct and legal threats against board members. Sarah's response was swift. She filed a complaint with the Colorado Division of Real Estate, which oversees HOA management, detailing the harassment and retaliation. She also sent a second letter to the board warning that the retaliatory fine would be used as evidence in a potential civil suit. The Division of Real Estate took the complaint seriously. An investigator contacted several residents, including me, Dave, and Jennifer, to document the pattern of behavior. The investigator also requested copies of all fines issued over the past 2 years, all board meeting minutes, and all correspondence between the board and residents. As the investigator dug deeper, things got worse for Patricia. It turned out she'd been issuing fines without proper board votes, pocketing some of the money instead of depositing it in the HOA account. The amount wasn't huge, maybe $3,000 over 2 years, but it was embezzlement nonetheless. When confronted with the evidence, Patricia initially denied everything. Then she claimed it was an accounting error. Then she tried to blame Margaret, saying the secretary should have caught the discrepancies. The Division of Real Estate suspended Patricia from serving on any HOA board while they completed their investigation. They also referred the matter to the local district attorney for potential criminal charges. The election went forward as scheduled. Without Patricia actively campaigning, and with news of the investigation spreading through the community, the outcome was a landslide. Dave, Jennifer, and I were elected along with 2 other reform-minded residents. The moderate slate took the remaining seats. Patricia's entire slate lost decisively. Our first act as the new board was to rescind all fines issued in the 3 months prior to the election. That included my $500 torch fine and the $2,000 retaliatory fine. We also established a new appeals process with neutral arbitration for disputed violations. Next, we went through the entire HOA covenant line by line. We eliminated dozens of overly restrictive rules, including the prohibition on open flames for property maintenance. We kept rules that made sense for safety and property values, but added explicit language requiring board members to consider context and reasonableness before issuing fines. We also implemented term limits for board members, ensuring no one could dominate the HOA the way Patricia had. And we created a transparency requirement, putting all board meeting minutes and financial records online for residents to review. The changes transformed the neighborhood atmosphere. People were friendlier, more willing to help each other out without fear of HOA repercussions. Block parties were organized. Kids played in front yards without parents worrying about bicycle violations. It felt like a real community instead of a police state. Patricia's legal troubles continued. In May, the district attorney filed charges for embezzlement and fraud. The amounts were relatively small, but the deliberate nature of the theft made it a felony. She hired an expensive defense attorney and fought the charges, claiming the money was for board-related expenses that she'd forgotten to document. The trial took place in September. I attended every day, along with Dave and Jennifer. We watched as prosecutors laid out the evidence, fines issued without board approval, deposits made to Patricia's personal account instead of the HOA account, altered financial records to hide the theft. Patricia's defense was weak. Her attorney argued that the HOA's financial systems were disorganized and that Patricia had simply made honest mistakes. But the prosecution's forensic accountant testified that the pattern was too consistent to be accidental. Money had been systematically diverted over a 2-year period. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on 3 counts of embezzlement and 2 counts of fraud. The judge scheduled sentencing for October. At the sentencing hearing, several residents testified about the impact of Patricia's actions. Dave talked about the stress of constant fines and warnings. Jennifer described how her kids had been afraid to play outside for fear of violating some unknown rule. I spoke about the $500 torch fine and the retaliation that followed when I dared to push back. The judge listened carefully to all the testimony. When it was time to announce the sentence, he noted that while the monetary amount of the theft was relatively small, the breach of trust was significant. He sentenced Patricia to 18 months in prison, followed by 2 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the HOA and barred from serving on any HOA board in the future. Patricia's face crumpled as the sentence was read. Her attorney immediately filed notice of appeal, but the damage was done. She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, a fitting end to her reign of petty tyranny. Margaret and Robert faced their own consequences. While they hadn't been directly involved in the embezzlement, the investigation revealed that they'd rubber-stamped Patricia's decisions without proper oversight. The Division of Real Estate issued formal reprimands and required them to complete ethics training before they could serve on any HOA board again. Both chose to move out of Ridgewood Estates within months of the verdict. As for me, serving on the HOA board turned out to be surprisingly rewarding. We focused on genuine community improvements rather than rule enforcement. We organized neighborhood events, negotiated better rates for snow removal and landscaping, and created a reserve fund for common area maintenance that actually made sense. The hair dryer incident became something of a legend in the community. At our first neighborhood barbecue under the new board, someone gave me a trophy, a golden hair dryer mounted on a wooden base with a plaque reading "Most Creative Compliance." It sits on my mantle to this day. Winter came around again, and with it, more freezing rain and ice. This time, when my driveway froze over, I pulled out my propane torch without a second thought. I cleared the ice in 10 minutes, safely and efficiently, exactly as I should have been allowed to do from the start. Dave came over as I was finishing up. "No hair dryer this time," he joked. "Don't need it. The rules actually make sense now." Who would have thought fighting an HOA would turn into a full-time hobby? It wasn't supposed to be a fight, I said. I just wanted to clear my driveway without breaking my neck. And now Patricia's in prison. We've reformed the entire HOA and you're a neighborhood hero, I laughed. I'm not a hero. I'm just a guy who got pissed off about a stupid fine. Sometimes that's all it takes to change things." He was right. The whole situation had started because I'd refused to accept an unjust fine for doing something completely reasonable. I could have paid the $500 and moved on, avoiding the conflict. But that would have left Patricia in power, continuing her petty tyranny unchecked. Instead, by pushing back, by using that hair dryer for 10 hours in an act of malicious compliance, I'd exposed the absurdity of the rules and catalyzed a movement that transformed the entire community. It hadn't been my intention, but I was glad it had worked out that way. The following spring, we held elections for the board positions that were up for rotation. The turnout was strong, and several good candidates stepped forward. The whole process was transparent and fair, exactly as it should have been from the start. I chose not to run for re-election. I'd served my purpose, helped reform the HOA, and now I wanted to step back and just enjoy my house and neighborhood without the added responsibility. Dave was re-elected, and Jennifer stayed on as well, providing continuity while new voices joined the board. Life in Ridgewood Estates settled into a comfortable rhythm. The mountain views were still spectacular, the community was genuinely friendly, and I could maintain my property without fear of arbitrary fines. It was everything I'd hoped for when I'd moved there, finally achieved after months of conflict and struggle. I ran into Margaret once at a grocery store in Denver, several months after she'd moved away. She looked older, tired. She saw me and quickly turned down another aisle, avoiding eye contact. I felt a momentary pang of sympathy, before remembering all the unreasonable fines and warnings she'd supported during her time on the board. Patricia's appeal was denied, and she served her full sentence. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved to Arizona after her release, living with her sister and working at a retail job. The fall from her position of petty power must have been devastating, but she'd brought it on herself through her own actions. The most satisfying part of the whole experience was seeing how the neighborhood thrived once the oppressive rules were lifted. Property values actually increased, contrary to Patricia's warnings that loosening standards would diminish home worth. Turns out, people wanted to live in a community that was reasonable and friendly rather than one that felt like living under constant surveillance. We established new traditions: monthly community coffees at the clubhouse, a summer concert series in the common area, a holiday lights competition that was actually fun rather than stressful. Kids played in the streets again, neighbors chatted over fences, and people helped each other out without worrying about HOA implications. The hair dryer itself, the commercial-grade model I'd bought for my act of malicious compliance, sat in my garage as a reminder of how the whole thing started. I'd used it a few more times for legitimate purposes, drying paint or thawing frozen outdoor faucets, but never again for melting ice. The torch was faster, safer, and now perfectly legal under our revised rules. Looking back, I realized that the entire conflict had taught me important lessons about standing up against unjust authority. It would have been easier to comply, to pay the fine and suffer through Patricia's arbitrary rules. But sometimes the easy path isn't the right path. Sometimes you have to fight back, even over something as seemingly trivial as how you melt ice on your driveway. The fight had also revealed the strength of community. I hadn't been alone in my frustration with the HOA's overreach. Dave, Jennifer, and dozens of other residents had been equally fed up but hadn't known how to push back. My hair dryer protest had given them a rallying point, a clear example of the absurdity they'd all been experiencing. Years later, I still live in Ridgewood Estates. the community continues to thrive under reasonable management. New residents occasionally ask about the HOA drama they've heard rumors about, and longtime residents happily share the story of the hair dryer rebellion. The whole experience became a cautionary tale that spread beyond our neighborhood. Other Colorado HOAs heard about what happened to Patricia and became more cautious about overly aggressive enforcement. Some implemented reforms proactively, hoping to avoid similar conflicts. The local media occasionally referenced the Ridgewood example when covering HOA disputes elsewhere. I even got a call once from a homeowner in Texas who was dealing with a similar situation. His HOA had fined him for pressure washing his driveway on a Sunday, claiming it violated quiet hours. I shared my experience, encouraged him to document everything, and suggested malicious compliance as a strategy if legal methods failed. Last I heard, his HOA had backed down after he threatened to wash his driveway with a toothbrush and soapy water every day for a month. The propane torch that started everything still sits in my garage, right next to the famous hair dryer. Sometimes, when I'm grabbing tools or working on a project, I look at them and smile, remembering that winter when a simple act of clearing ice turned into a neighborhood revolution. On particularly icy mornings when I fire up the torch to quickly clear my driveway, I think about Patricia and her clipboard, about that first $500 fine, about the 10 hours I spent with a hair dryer in an act of petty revenge that spiraled into something much bigger. I think about how a small act of resistance exposed a pattern of abuse and ultimately brought positive change to an entire community. The story has a happy ending, which isn't always the case with HOA conflicts. Many people suffer under oppressive boards without the ability or energy to fight back. I was fortunate to have supportive neighbors, legal resources, and the stubbornness to see it through. Not everyone has those advantages. That's why I'm always willing to share the story when people ask. Not to glorify myself, but to demonstrate that change is possible. HOAs don't have to be tyrannical. Rules can be reasonable. Communities can be friendly and well-maintained without constant threats of fines and violations. All it takes is people willing to stand up and say, "This is wrong," when they see injustice, even in something as mundane as a $500 fine for using a torch to melt ice. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance create the biggest waves of change. And sometimes, all you need is a hair dryer and the determination to use it for 10 hours straight to prove a point that changes everything.